everyone, and welcome to this panel. Talk is Cheap, Ethical Critiquing in the Internet Age. I am Isabel, and I am joined here today by a selection of my wonderful panelists, and I'll let them introduce themselves. So, Gotham, let's start with you.
Hi, I'm Gottlieb. My pronouns are they, them. Speaking to you from Wajak Noongar Butcher. And before I begin, I'd just like to pay respects to elders past and present. And that's it. That's me, right?
Yep. Yeah. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself as a writer?
Yeah, sure. So I was a magazine editor for a magazine called Dash, and I've been a writer and artist. Based in Bulu in Perth. And I will mostly be talking about, I guess, like fan art, fan criticism as a form of criticism, particularly one I think that's like relevant and kind of speaks to what criticism is like in an age where most criticism is digital.
Yeah, great. Sumin?
Hi, I'm Sumin, she, her, and I live, work, write, and study on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land. A little bit about myself. I am a visual arts critic, so very specific. Very specific background. I did art history at uni, and I'm at ANU studying art history, so I have really found myself in a niche and mostly visual arts criticism. So that's me.
Great. Olivia?
Hi, I'm Olivia, and I am broadcasting, coming to you from Wurundjeri land today. A bit about me as a writer. So in terms of criticism, possibly even more niche, perhaps, I basically review audio described theatre. So reviewing it from a disability access perspective as well as a theatre perspective. But I also write memoir and fiction and fun things like that.
Oh, fantastic. And Michael?
Hey, so I'm Michael. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm currently on Gadigal land. So I feel like I am generally like a film critic and a writer, but I also try and like bring in other forms of criticism in there as well when I can, like music and art and technology. And I'm currently working as the culture editor at Netflix through Junkie.
Great, thank you so much, Michael. And I'm here on Ghana country, and as far as criticism is concerned, I've already fessed up to my wonderful panelists here that I am not really a critic at all or an expert, but I do sometimes review YA and middle fiction novels, which I very much enjoy, mostly because I get to read YA and middle fiction books, which is always a delight. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to just start off with a little question, and we'll see where we go from here. Do you think that it's possible to maintain a really robust critical community in an age that is so digitally focused? Sumin, shall I start with you here? Oh, scary face.
I guess I'm quite biased in that. I think I advocate a lot for deep research, deep care, deep attention, and I think that the internet in some ways can compromise that, but also actually help with that. So I do think there's no clear answer to that very complicated question. But I do think from my own, I guess, history with criticism, I started off using Instagram stories, just saying, I hate this exhibition. And until I got the confidence to make a pitch. So I do think that the internet is incredibly important, and criticism has always been very elite, and I think that's all breaking down now because of the internet.
Michael, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I feel like it's really interesting what you said about like almost the accessibility of criticism. I think in a way that like the internet has made criticism more accessible to people who normally would not have had avenues to get into criticism. And I think it's nice, especially in like film criticism, to see like a whole bunch of new publications start up in the past couple of years. Like obviously we have things like Rough Cut, which was like started by a bunch of amazing young critics from all over the country, just as kind of like an upstart film publication that's now become like nationally recognized, and I think it publishes some of like the best film criticism in this country. And I think we also are seeing like other digital publications, even like Running Dog, which I know that Sumin, both of us have written for. Like I think it just allows a new space for people who may not have had avenues, or like those publications that do kind of may exist in like an ivory tower. I'm talking like print publications specifically. I think a lot of them are positioned as more elite. It almost feels like digitally there's been more space for people to produce criticism and produce like more experimental criticism. So looking at like different forms of how to critique things, not just writing like the traditional review, but blending it with like memoir, or as like Running Dog does, a lot of like multimedia kind of criticism, incorporating different forms into that style.
Yeah, absolutely. Olivia, do you have any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I'm just thinking now. I've never really considered it before. I suppose I have in a sort of roundabout, back of the mind sort of way. But you know, that elitism of traditional sort of criticism, I wouldn't probably have even had a chance. Like, where was the space for, you know, someone specifically with a specific disability to say, well, this I'm going to talk about audio described theatre and review the theatre itself and the audio description, and it's never really happened before. But yeah, I can do that because of the internet, because there's space out there for new voices and people to, and also for people to practice. Sort of, you can start, you know, on your Twitter or your Instagram or your blog kind of, you know, and you can get your style, your way of doing criticism, and then gain the confidence to maybe, pitch or put it out there somewhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose the answer here is pretty obvious as far as you're concerned. Fan fiction is so entwined with the digital age. Well, no, I mean, obviously it started so long ago, you know, but big communities are based online. So what are your thoughts?
I guess like my response to that question is thinking about the role of the critic in terms of the community as well.
Yeah.
Because like, you know, is it possible to maintain a robust criticism? There's, I guess, like a type of value attached to like what robust means in that sense. I guess the way in which I've been conceptualizing or thinking through what fan fiction or fan art does in terms of criticism is thinking through the role of people who create fan art in not just reading a text, but also responding to it with that reading. And I think that's what's really interesting for me about like fan created works. So for instance, you know, the early kind of seminal slash fiction of like Kirk and Spock making out, that to me is also a criticism of Star Trek and the lack of emotional depth between male characters on the show. And so that's a really interesting way in which criticism functions. In terms of like the digital age, I think Sumin talking about the lack of depth, I think that's definitely something I think about a lot. And actually, I feel like that's a real problem because a lack of time spent with the work is, you know, a lack of that deeper sense of connection, I think, that we want when we connect with art forms, you know, whether that's literature or visual art. And this kind of like a hyper present sense in which writing and art and criticism and dialogue, you know, bombards us in our everyday life. And the way in which as well, because of, you know, how we are engaging with this through Instagram or Facebook, where what happens is what we like gets put back to us. And then again, there's a lack of a proper kind of development of the self. in through fan art. So ages ago, I wrote a piece on Derrida's archive fever, and the role played for archivists, and I think it's a similar role for a critic, in the sense that you don't necessarily own the work. The author themselves doesn't really own the work. What the critic does is perform a function where it's about directing community conversation, or connecting the work to communities. And so I think like Olivia's like criticism of the fact that a major issue with criticism is its lack of accessibility, when it's purportedly meant to be about the whole community and how the whole community engages, which I guess is like this is another tangential thing, but like part of the issue I think as well with the digital age is it's harder to choose the community that needs to hear it in some ways. In some ways it's easier, in some ways it's harder. In the sense that, like, for instance, I've been engaging, like I've got Cantonese heritage, and so I've been engaging a lot with particular works directed to the Cantonese diaspora, and I couldn't do that without Instagram or without Facebook. And so that's really validating and actually unlocking a lot of different parts of how I see myself. But at the same time, there's other things where because of, because market forces are now like attention forces, in the sense that like our attention is monetized. What that means is you've got works that are kind of sweeping through and directing attention in a way that's harmful to some communities as well.
Yeah, 100%. Anyone have any responses there or any more thoughts?
Yeah, I think like talking about social media specifically, like I think one thing we should really touch on now, I guess, is like Twitter and the role that Twitter is playing in like criticism, right? Because I think I've like so many times, and I guess this is like the kind of tension that exists within digitality and criticism as a whole, is that because so many people are now able to critique and able to just like offer an opinion to the world, we also have this like influx or like this phenomenon where it's like sometimes, like one opinion becomes the most popular one, especially on Twitter, where we see like there is just like Twitter is a hive mind. We know this. I don't think we're all a part of it. And I think like often it will be that one opinion becomes like the most popular one, and like everyone, like stands a movie or like stands a particular piece of art. And then that just becomes like the dominant discourse. And I really think that can be quite damaging to see when critics of that discourse then get like cancelled. You know what I mean? Like, e.g., I remember, maybe this is a controversial example, but I remember when Trick Mirror came out, and then obviously that was like a huge book, like in many of the scenes that I guess we would be a part of. And then that one review from Lauren Euler in the London Review of Books came out, and she just got like so much attack from Gia Tolentino stans, I guess, which is so weird because it's like the concept of standing a critic or a journalist themselves is so weird to me. Anyway, that's just some thoughts.
No, it's such an interesting point, and it actually brings me on to one of the other questions that I had written down here. We've been talking a lot sort of behind the scenes about this. Just the thought about there's so much media consumption now is so hectic and it's so constant and it's just absolutely everywhere at all times. And there's like a really strange relationship as far as criticism is concerned about like where's the line being sort of critical for the audience's benefit, but also where do you place the compassion there? Like, if something is absolutely terrible, do you just go ahead and kind of call it? Because, if whatever you say, people can instantly reflect upon that, and they can instantly and they do instantly go back to the artist and start talking to them directly. Like, what is the responsibility of critics in this scenario? Is there even, or, I don't know. Olivia, what do you think?
Oh, it's I don't even. I always my first response is to always just write what I think. just be honest, and then I can go back and I go, maybe being a bit, you know, unreasonable here. I mean, thankfully, I've never actually had to review something that was just had no redeemable qualities. So, but I think for me, it's difficult too. I think because if I'm reviewing a big play for like it's put on by MTC or the Malthouse or something, I'm much more comfortable. Like, I don't want to outright hang shit on it just for the fun of it. If it's good, it's good. And if it's got redeemable qualities, fantastic. But I'm more comfortable sort of going, I didn't like this. This is why. Back it up, obviously. But it's still just, you know, my random one-person opinion. But, you know, recently, I think, especially because of this whole, you know, online, digital everything, there are a lot of things that are good things that have come out of it for me. I've been able to review things on a much smaller scale because they've been presented with accessibility in mind, which doesn't always happen, you know, in smaller productions when we're in actual theatre. So, you know, I've had to review a piece that was by an artist with a disability. She'd included audio description, you know, in her creative process. She described it herself. It was part of the art itself. But I found it almost completely inaccessible. But I didn't just be like, this is terrible, you've done a terrible thing. So it was finding the balance of like saying, I understand what she was trying to do, but she didn't quite pull it off. And I think I spend a lot of my reviews, because it was a dance piece. So I spend a lot of my reviews actually explaining why in the first place dance, even if you describe it, is not that accessible to someone who's never seen anything. So I think a lot of it for me comes down to, if I don't want to just be completely negative, I have to do all this explaining of why it is so inaccessible, why it is the way it is, why what she's tried to do doesn't quite hit the mark. And then I think that's how I, you know, I want to say that's how I make myself feel better about not completely just going, oh my God, that was a giant pile. Which it wasn't. Sorry, I talked over you then. What did you say?
Sorry. I just said that also sort of shifts the role slightly when you're doing that work. That's teaching work rather than just straight criticism.
Yeah, and I don't think it ever is. I think with some of those larger productions, you know, I'm basically reviewing the show, and also how I could access it. Yeah, but with some of those smaller things, especially I've been doing actually a lot more dance lately, which is really interesting for me. So yeah, there's also that teaching, educating within the review itself, or else me just going, it was terrible, and then someone watching it going, actually that was, you know, which, you know, they might do anyway, but I feel like I need to give all that background information, which the writing itself becomes a little bit torturous, but also interesting, and I can sort through my own thoughts when I'm writing it out as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Gottlieb, you look like you're thinking something there.
Yeah, well, I guess like the thing that I think about a lot now since reading a little bit about it is that like I feel like two things. So like one is like the difference between this cultural practice of criticism that we're talking about, that I think we're all the same page about, in terms of like how a critic functions now practically within the structures that are. But then I think I've been talking in a different way about like, okay, so what is a critic within many different conceptions of what society is and what art production is. So, you know, just as an example, I've never seen like a review of Lion Dance, but that's definitely like a cultural performance that happens all the time. So the other thing that I was thinking about, I guess, is that the sense in which we have this idea of aesthetics and art production, a lot of it is informed by Western philosophy, particularly from Kant and Hegel. And so these are two white men that kept lists of races, which ones were best, and delivered these in lectures. As well as that, these are people who rewrote history books so that they could write out women and write out, non-Western Europeans as well. And so the sense of the distanced critic in charge of what aesthetics is, for me, is a problematic position. It's a position of power, and sometimes it's a temporary position of power, in the sense of even if you might identify that you come from a disadvantaged background, when you take on the role of a critic and you take on the role of a critic in a major publication, that's a position of power as well. And it's a position of power where you're adopting a type of mantle that itself has a fairly dark lineage for me. So again, in terms of what a robust criticism is, I feel like what we have now, even if it's identified as less robust, is better because it's more manifold, because it's the power is, it's easier to shift the power and to shift it back to communities. And I think that's an important role and an important thing to say with regards to what criticism is now.
Do you think that there's space within the creative process for critics' craft and the way that critics respond to work to be incorporated into the development process? Or do you think absolutely no, not appropriate? Michael, what are your thoughts?
I feel like instinctively I would probably say no, just because I feel like when someone is creating a work, I feel like they shouldn't be creating it just because they want a critic to praise it. It's like that's almost not the role, or that's not the power of a critic. It very much should be the person creating like the work creates it because they want to be creating it, not because that they're shaping it in a certain way that it's going to get critical acclaim. Although I think that is the way some work is definitely created, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way that I think it should be. I think that there is definitely space in the development project. Obviously, maybe not for an actual critical standpoint to come in, but it's more people who come in and obviously normal review processes are should still be in place. People should still be thinking about sensitivities to different audiences and accessibility and things like that. But I don't think that necessarily counts as criticism per se.
No, I think you need to distinguish between writing for a critic, or writing for your your audience and critics is, I think, for me, different things. And I think you need to write or create with your audience maybe in mind if you have a specific one. If I'm writing for a middle grade audience, which I do, I have them in mind as my audience and what's appropriate and what's accessible. But yeah, I don't writing with incorporating criticism. I don't. My first thought would be no. But yeah, audience and critics, two different things. I think is something. Yeah.
So my personal background. And I feel like I'm going to assume that it's sort of similar within visual arts here, Simon, but my personal background is within fringe theatre, and there's a sort of ongoing problem in which people want reviews because, then you can get a pull quote, and a pull quote can sell a ticket, and it's fringe theatre, so you need them dollars. But additionally, a lot of the time people critiquing fringe theatre, and not exclusively, but quite a lot of the time, might not have experience within the areas that they are critiquing. Do you think that that's? I suppose I'm wondering what you all think the kind of ethical implications are there. There's, on one hand, you have kind of gatekeeping issues, but then on the other hand, you have someone who's never seen a damn show at all. Going in and being I didn't like the movement. really extreme reaction, but you kind of, I suppose, hopefully get where I'm coming from. Sumin, what do you think? I feel like I've got visual arts critics who have complained similar things about this.
I think, at least with the art realm, it's so enmeshed with capital now that they do mostly want promotional pieces. And it took me a long time to realize that there are categories. You know, there's a preview, which is what galleries want to sell. There are artist profiles, which also intends to sell. Then there are reviews and essays, which, in my opinion, that is criticism. I think there's a big difference between criticism, between judgment, which we're talking about, and also puff pieces. And it's something that I definitely struggle with because you still gotta eat. So sometimes you have to do the puff pieces. But at the end of the day, I think real criticism is about critical nuance. And it was interesting you talked about compassion before, because I think a lot of people see them as a polarized opposite, that if you're being critical, you're not being compassionate. But I think they're actually synonymous. It takes me so long to actually sit and listen and deeply respect a work of art enough to want to criticize it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you are put in a position where you are clearly being hired to write a puff piece and you would like to do some actual criticism? Yeah, quite frequently.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah.
Actually, that identity comes a lot into it. I think I've mostly been commissioned to write about Asian art, which is fine because it's what I've specialized in. But sometimes I find that ridiculously limiting. And it's because they don't have other Asian art critics, which is a huge problem. So I do feel tokenized, but also there's a lot of pieces and they are ridiculously formulaic and it feels like worms in my brain. I hate writing them. I'm still navigating that space, but I do think it comes back to what we were talking about in terms of audience. That happens when I forget my audience. So if I prioritize my audience and my community at all times, I won't have worms in my brain.
Sumin, I find it so funny that you say that you wouldn't have worms in your brain if X happened, because I feel like no matter what, I would still have brain worms. That's entirely beside the point. I feel like like compassion is something that is so important in any criticism, and I think that as long as we keep that in mind and like that is like the core of our practice and the core of our work, I do think it's like the work that we will be able to critique and like the opinions that we are allowed to deliver, it's almost like unlimited, because it's not like we shouldn't be allowed to critique something or like give a bad review just because it's like we're afraid that that person is going to lose their livelihood, for example. Like I think that's almost the precarious economic reality of criticism. Is that often when we are reviewing local work, or especially something like a local fringe show, that there is that expectation that, you know, if you don't give a good review, that show could lose money, or like you won't be supporting local artists, which I don't think is quite true, because I think you actually have a responsibility as a critic to the arts community to be critiquing work fairly and not just writing puff pieces. Unfortunately, I do think there is that unfortunate economic reality still, or as long as your criticism is coming from a place of compassion and it's not coming from a place where you want to punch down on that person, I think, yeah, criticism should still exist in an accurate and fair manner. Going back to your previous question, though, Isabel, about like, should people be allowed to critique work that they're not specialized in, or that they don't have like particular knowledge of? I also think it's like about approaching it with good intentions. I think as a critic, if you don't have knowledge of something, you should just come out and say it. Like if I had been commissioned to review a dance piece or like similar, and there was a particular reason they wanted someone who, you know, was not knowledgeable in dance to review it, then I think as a critic, you should be very open with your shortcomings. And I think like an auxiliary result of that is that almost helps break down criticism from the ivory tower, is that I think people often view really high level critics as people who are just like omniscient and like know everything and know everyone, when in reality it's like no one has watched every single movie, or no one has like consumed every single piece of media there is to exist. And it's more than okay to have blind spots as long as you admit that, and you don't pretend to know everything.
Yeah, I do. I do that myself. I always flag it. I always say I think I've even said I didn't want to watch this or like in the past. Up recently where it was an entirely online movement thing, and I was like, I didn't want to see this. But you know, watching it actually changed my mind. But I always flag I have very little knowledge of this thing or whatever it might be, because I feel like the reader needs to know that sort of thing. You know, I'm not coming to this from a place of complete understanding and complete knowledge, but I have opinions about it, and yeah, does that make sense? I don't know.
It makes total sense to me, and I feel like as a reader, I would personally prefer to know people's personal background. I mean, I'm sure you all watched oh my goodness, what was it called? Margaret and David's movie show back in the day. I feel like there are none amongst us who don't know if they identify more with Margaret or David's opinions. Like, you just, once you watch, like, you kind of get to that point where you know what people are into, you know what people like, and if it's a piece of criticism, you don't have that relationship with the writer, then it can be sort of hard to discern what are you going to get out of it. Yeah. I guess let's move on slightly. We've talked a little bit about how it's sort of a little bit easier to get into criticism now, a little bit easier to approach. I guess I would like to know what advice you all have for people who are aspiring critics. Let's start with Goklim. Do you have any advice that you would give?
Yeah, well, I guess that just like it'd be similar advice that I'd give like an emerging artist or writer as well.
Yeah.
I think that like just remembering that like your commitment to your communities and the people that surround you, but also understanding that commitment, even if it's like passionate, that it's also one in which, you know, you have to understand and figure out what the truth of that is. I guess, yeah, kind of like gently saying you can't really, I guess there's a tendency, particularly when you start out, to build camaraderie that can turn into the type of puff pieces that Suman was talking about as well. So, yeah, I guess that's my advice.
Great. Suman?
I'm going to cheat, and this is actually something that Naomi Riddle, who's the editor of Running Dog, once told me.
Yeah, that's legitimate. Pass on the knowledge.
But yeah, I mean, her generosity is something that I want to pass forward, and you know, she's a very generous editor. She's the best. But she is a big advocate of, I guess, the flexibility and the power and resistance that lies outside of capital. And when she told me that as a young writer, that really helped a lot in terms of negotiating my voice and, I guess, critical integrity. You don't have to be following whatever this metric of success is all the time. And I think, as Goklim said, recognizing the history of criticism as something deeply violent is also really, really important.
Yeah.
So if you are starting off, look into your discipline and where it's failed in the past and how it can progress moving forward, I think.
Yeah. Michael?
I think, like, for me, just like almost more practical advice. I think if you're starting out as a critic, you should really consider what type of criticism you want to write and why you want to write it. I think that's almost like very cliched advice, but I still think it rings true in the sense that it's like, do you want to be writing like long essays, or do you want to be writing like shorter journalistic pieces? Is the reason you want to enter criticism just because you want to disseminate your opinion, or do you want to be published or paid? I think like all of these things like are questions that seem so obvious, but without asking them to yourself, and I think I still ask that to myself when I'm pitching new pieces, But like without asking those questions, it can be so easy to suddenly find yourself in a place where you're like, oh, like actually that's not the kind of criticism I want to write. Or it's like sometimes you might find yourself like reviewing pieces for your student paper and be like, oh, like actually I don't want to be writing journalistic reviews. I like want to be writing more experimental work. So I think obviously all of this will come with time as well. And like a lot of it is trial and error, finding out what you like and don't like. But I think that's just like a good mindset to go into it with. So you know that not everything you write is going to be exactly where you want to end up or will end up. I also think it's like really important to reach out to writers and critics who you already admire the work of, and like 9 times out of 10 they will be more than willing to, you know, like have a chat or just like talk you through how they got started in the industry, or like even give you some advice. Definitely like can't speak for anyone else here, but like if you're watching this, like feel free to hit me up if you're like into like film criticism. I'm sure everyone else will be also willing to like offer their resources. And yeah, like I think a lot of the industry is resource sharing. It's like talking to people who are already in and getting those like that knowledge that can only come from having that experience.
Fantastic. Olivia?
Well, I was going to say what Michael said. Why do you want to be a critic as opposed to, you know, something else? I mean, in this, you know, era, most people probably are a critic and something else. But ask yourself why it is that you want to write criticism. And if it's just so you can like be mean about films you don't like or stuff you don't like, that's probably not a great reason to do it. But you know, I think always keep it. This sounds super cliche, but always keep an open mind. Like if you think, oh, this is, say we're talking about books, I don't know. If you go into reading a book going, you know, I'm going to review this and it's going to be a terrible review because I just know I'm going to hate it. You know, again, not the mindset to have, I don't think. Keep an open mind. And read criticism. Maybe be passionate about something you already do, but I've myself found that when I started out, I hadn't actually read that much theatre criticism. Like, you know, you read the occasional thing, but I'd never really deep dove into it. So I think, like you say to, you know, aspiring writers, read widely, you'll be a better writer. I think the more criticism, the more different types of criticism you read, the better critic you'll be, and it'll, you know, it helps evolve your own style, your own process. I think that's the best advice I can give.
Yeah. And a sort of opposite angle, similar question, I guess. Imagine that each of you are, you know, the CEO of some huge corporation, media corporation. What would you, in that position, what would you do to develop and encourage, you know, the professional development of new emerging critics? I mean, obviously this is sort of general to just general writers as well, but specifically critics. You know, what would you do in a way that would develop the critics, but also provide them with the support to develop the works, I suppose. Yeah. Sumin, let's go with you first. It was very pressured, so I had to jump on you, sorry.
Firstly, I hope I never become a CEO. Timeline. I hope CEOs don't exist in the future. Let's say I have a channel, not a CEO. I think the biggest challenge that I've seen is I don't think there are enough programs generally. And speaking from a visual art sector, what tends to happen is there's a lot of things for emerging artists, a lot of things for emerging poets maybe, but nothing for critics. I think there's one in Melbourne, Gertrude Contemporary does one, but that's, First Draft does a developing writers, but that tends to again go to more creative writers, whatever that means. I think criticism definitely falls through. So if I was not a CEO, someone with a bit
Sorry,
more.
a leader of a very fancy arts organization.
Yeah, I would maybe try to establish more mentorships because I just don't think the support
Yeah,
network.
great. Goklim, how about you? You don't have to be a CEO. I'm sorry, I used a bad word there.
Well, I guess is like, I mean, I feel like we all know that there's a real issue with definitely like racial hegemony in the Australian arts industry. I think that's probably the one that I try to tackle, like in like ways similar to Human's answer in establishing mentorships, but also like I guess in maybe changing how those organizations are structured and thinking through how that happens. So I guess the thing that I do the first, if I was like in a position of power, is just share and disseminate that power as much as possible to as many different types of communities as possible that haven't really received the support that they need in order to, break through these kind of systematic barriers of access. Yeah. I don't have like specific solutions because I never dreamed that I'd be in this position.
I'll be honest, I'm only asking so that at the end of the festival I can package all of these up and send them to Scott Morrison. Like, this is what we want.
Yeah.
Olivia, how about you? Do you have an answer in this very surreal, mythical scenario?
I don't think I have a different answer.
Similar.
Yeah, very similar. And I think even from my own personal experience, I didn't set out to become a critic of anything. It was all a bunch of, happy circumstances that led to what I get to do now. So I think seeking out people, writers, performers, artists, whoever, that, have come from a background that isn't necessarily ever represented, and giving people the opportunity and giving them, the chance to give it a go and see what happens. I think that ties in with what's been said already. Because there are people out there who might, want to, but have never thought about it.
Yeah. 100%. Anything from you on this topic, Michael?
Look, nothing too much more to add except just like commission new writers. And I feel like it's honestly, it's never been easier to commission new writers because there are so many initiatives now, which is literally all about just like compiling lists of new writers, lists of writers from like marginalized backgrounds. There's like a great one that was created by Jinghua Qian a few months ago that's called Critical Mass, which is all about like getting underrepresented critics and writers in. It's literally one massive spreadsheet where anyone can add their details. Editors can look at it as well. I think like, especially a few months ago, when I guess the world came to another like racial reckoning, there were so many publications I saw that were calling out, being like, writers of color, like hit me up, like pitch me. But then actually in my mind, I'm like, how many of those like actually ended up being commissioned? Like, it's just like, I feel like even though people want to seem like they're commissioning new people or maybe they're open to it, I would love to actually see how many new underrepresented writers actually get commissioned in the end. And I think that's something that just needs to change. Like take a risk on a writer you haven't published before.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you so much. I think we're going to wrap things up now, but does anyone have anything, any final thoughts for the panel? Anyone? No, we're all good. That's great.
I just want to say that I feel really grateful to be on a panel with you all. I've read and been fans of your critical writing and learned a lot from it. So it's really nice that this has happened.
Well, thank you all so much. This has been really great, and this has been us here at National Writers Festival, and we're going to end now. So bye.
See you later.
See ya.